I mean, one, like we know glucose creates a lot of I'll say inflammation to make it seem easy. It's oxidative stress,
Yes.
reactive oxygen species. But just for simplification, when your cells are metabolizing a lot of glucose, you increase the amount of oxidative stress or inflammation that is occurring. So when the brain's metabolizing ketones over glucose, you actually get a double whammy from like a neuroinflammation standpoint of you're reducing the amount that's being produced of oxidative stress, but you're also increasing your natural production of antioxidants. So that's one of the reasons why we see a big boost in long-term brain health. There's hasn't been studies as much, but there's a recent review that just came out, for instance, that was looking at all of the available literature on keto for Alzheimer's. And there's, a lot of benefit from the few, studies that are out at this point. We're seeing a lot of positive results on this. And it's because of that fact that one of the reasons, there's several reasons, but one of the reasons is this reduction in neuroinflammation that's coming from it. So ketones really are kind of this interesting, magical molecule that it's, we look at them as an energy substrate, but there's actually a lot of other things that they're providing for the body.
Yeah, love that. And I think that it warrants maybe going into inflammation land a little bit, because I think that most people misunderstand the concept of inflammation. They don't understand let's say the benefits that might, we'll say the different physiological processes, we'll say, between short-term acute inflammation, things like exercise, which is an acute hormetic stressor, let's say, and long-term low-grade chronic inflammation, which is what I believe you're talking about here. So when we have chronic low-grade inflammation, this is going to induce, as you mentioned, a metabolic switch to this, we'll say energetically, and it's an efficient way of producing energy, oxidative phosphorylation, to fast-acting but less efficient aerobic glycolysis. And this is what you're talking about, where we're going to increase those reactive oxygen species. We're going to reduce the insulin sensitivity. And then of course, these effects, then the net essentially is like this reduced glucose availability and therefore reduced cellular energy as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think it is an important distinction to make. I think, inflammations like stress and cortisol, where it gets this bad reputation, everybody thinks that in any amount, it's not good for you. Inflammation is a good thing acutely, as you mentioned. If you have an injury, inflammation is going to help with recovery. If you're trying to recover from exercise, that acute inflammation is actually the driver of the positive adaptation that you're trying to accomplish. So this is the hormetic stressor that you're speaking of. So, that part is a great thing, but it's the chronic inflammation that is the issue. And, mostly chronic inflammation is going to be driven by diet. It's what we're putting in our bodies that's going to be causing that. And you kind of get this, you get it from a lot of different areas, even in the nutrition component, because there's this component of if our cells are metabolizing a lot of glucose and we're using a lot of those metabolic pathways to metabolize that glucose, we're going to be creating a lot of this reactive oxygen species. So we're going to have a natural increase in our inflammation production. But then there's all the other things that come with it too. There's the digestive distress that can, target an immune inflammation response where, you're consuming certain foods. Maybe it's, you're overloaded on plant toxins, or you're consuming some just different pro-inflammatory ingredients that are found in a lot of processed foods. Now you're causing your immune system to have a response to that, and that's driving up inflammation. So the inflammation can be produced in a lot of different ways. But interestingly enough, if we get our diet under check, we start to see that really improve. One of the more common markers that people will use for measuring systemic inflammation is high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or if on your blood test, you may see it as HS-CRP. This number we tend to see improve on, we see it improve on a low carb keto diet. But we especially see it improve on a low carb keto diet consisting of whole foods that have removed a lot of those inflammatory things. And it really is important. Like if you look at, right now, I think insulin resistance has a lot of, it kind of has the stage right now. A lot of people are talking about insulin resistance, which is important because if you look at, almost every chronic disease or just chronic sickness or things that are, kind of complicating health for people, insulin resistance is at the root of it, but also is inflammation. And the two do tend to come hand in hand. With some people, there's a little bit of discrepancy. Is insulin resistance driving inflammation? Is inflammation driving insulin resistance? I think it's a little bit of both. We know the inflamed cell is probably not responding to insulin and glucose as well as it would if it weren't inflamed.
Yeah.
But we also know that, insulin resistance is going to kind of drive up inflammation naturally. So it's actually probably going a little bit of both ways, but it's important because you can't have optimal health in a state of chronic inflammation.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, I can't remember. I think it was Lane. I had Lane Norton on the show recently, and he was like, if I said to you, we're going to do this intervention and you are going to see like atrial fibrillations, like transient changes in your thyroid hormone. We're going to see all of these different, very scary things. Would you recommend it to your patient? And it was such a great question. I was like, of course not. And he's like, well, what I'm talking about is exercise,
Yeah.
And it's a really funny thing because we really conflate the two, like acute stress and inflammation that has a start and an end point. This is, it is an adaptive stress. It is a EU stress. So this is going to help you get better over time, even though it might suck. Like my hip thrusters sucked this morning, but I know that next time I get back there and I do that weight that I punched up today, it's going to be just a little, a squeak easier. And I think that those are the adaptations that we're really after. And I wanted to come back to gluconeogenesis because you mentioned it. And I think that in the context of the ketogenic community, I think that protein is often, and I will say with full transparency and honesty, I was on the bandwagon where I was like, too much protein, bad. I was like, team Walter Longo, it's like team Blue Zones. And I used to be there, since I have since switched teams. I'm sorry, Walter, but, and I do love his work. I think that he's done a lot of important work. So I'm not trying to bash him in any way, but I do think that he's missed the mark with protein and aging. Like I do, we've been talking about insulin and insulin insensitivity. And I think that as we age, as you mentioned, the brain gets a little bit more insulin resistant. The body gets a little bit more insulin resistant if you are not strategically putting in either a mechanical or a chemical stimulus to overcome that. So the mechanical stimulus would be the weights, let's say, or the cardiovascular work. And then the chemical stimulus would be, the foods that you're putting into your body, the types of food, the macronutrient split, that kind of thing. And I think that with protein specifically, I think that a lot of people in the ketogenic community get it wrong. And I remember when I was first kind of talking about higher protein, I was almost scared to do it. I was almost nervous to come out and like that. I think women need more protein and this is specifically for women because this is sort of my niche, if you will, where I would see women who were on like that 20 to 25%, as you mentioned before, they were on that ketogenic, like that macro split, let's say, and they were on it for years. And then we'd look at their thyroid and I'll be like, oh my God, this reverse T3, we have to get a handle on this. And just changing some of the macros a little bit. So maybe bringing them up from like a 20% to about a 40%. That's kind of the number that I like for women. 40% of their total calories coming from protein seems to really bring the thyroid, we'll say, back online. So let's talk a little bit about protein, maybe some misconceptions about protein in the ketogenic space, and then we can come back to women because we always seem to come back there. But let's talk a little bit about protein in general. Are you team protein or are you team low protein?
Yeah, so I'm definitely team protein, and like you, my stance has changed over the years. When I first started getting into, I think it's a natural progression most people go through. Like, nowadays it's because I think the way that the general recommendations are for 20 to 25% protein, if you just Google keto, that's kind of what pops up. Yep. But even in the early days, like when I studied keto in a lab setting, like my grad school, like we were studying it, we were working in an exercise science lab, we were reading all the research. But even then we were making this confusion because we were looking at the early models of the keto diet that were for epilepsy and they were for different things, right? So you were kind of trying to take that and then relate it to the stuff like we were studying athletes in our lab. So we're trying to like take this and relate it to over here, but it's two different goals, two different populations. There's so much different stuff going on. So I was definitely team low protein for a while too, with the same reason everybody else has of this fear that if you have too much protein, it's going to kick you out of ketosis. And for anybody who this is a new conversation for, this is based on, there is a process in the body, gluconeogenesis. We've mentioned it a couple times. It's a process where our body will take non-carbohydrate substrate like amino acids from protein and convert them into glucose. And it's a process that does exist, but the confusion is around how it gets activated. So a lot of people think that we talked about supply and demand driven processes. We talked about So a lot of people will think this gluconeogenesis is a supply-driven process where if you have too much protein, the body will have no choice but to convert that protein into glucose and then thus kick you out of ketosis. And there's a few things that are wrong with that, idea. The first idea I think that's wrong is that a lot of people, when they're figuring out, well, how much protein is enough protein, a lot of times we're just looking at studies that measure protein synthesis or muscle protein synthesis, how much protein is required to stimulate that process, which is important. It's really, we're talking about muscle here. Muscle is important for us to have. We can kind of get into that a little bit later, but that is an important thing, but it kind of misses the fact that protein's used for other things too. It's not just for muscle protein synthesis. Almost every process in our body requires amino acids to carry out the functions in our different bodily systems. So we can have, it's kind of, people have thought they're like, 30 to 40, I think it's 25 to 40 grams of protein is what they'll say is the most that you can tolerate in a feeding. And that's just based on that, studies show that if you go past that, you can't stimulate protein synthesis in a way is kind of like a switch. You can't further stimulate it past it. So people think that that's the threshold, but it's likely probably more than that. So that's one, I think that's one little misconception is the way that protein gets used. But then, one of the things that people will experience is that if they measure their glucose or their ketones after having a higher protein feeding, you might notice higher glucose and lower ketone levels. And that kind of reaffirms this idea that like, gluconeogenesis must be happening. But what people don't realize is that, unless you're having a meal of just fat, you're going to see some change in your glucose and ketone levels. But it's not because, the amount of protein that you had has kicked you out of ketosis. It's just that your fuel substrate has changed. Your demand for producing ketones is probably less now because you've consumed food. There's a lot of different things going on there. So, people will get kind of that affirmation. And let's look at
context. Let's look at okay, so maybe you do 30 minutes after, but what does it look like 2 hours after?
Exactly.
Or 3 or 4 hours after, right? Like we absolutely know that your glucose levels are going to be very transient and there's going to be a flux, let's say, of glucose in your blood post meal for about 2 hours or so. So I would be more curious about maybe the 30-minute reading, but then I'd be like, let's check again at 2 hours and see where we are. Right.
Yeah. And even if you look at some of the studies that are done in like type 2 diabetics, which we'd probably consider to be kind of the most metabolically compromised people, even the glucose spike from like massive protein feedings, like 50 to 60 grams of protein per feeding, maybe not massive to you and I, but generally speaking, most people consider that to be massive, only producing very minor increases in blood sugar. And that's in again, maybe the most metabolically compromised people. So it just doesn't check out in the research that this is a problem. But this misconception has created a lot of problems because even outside of the women aspect of it, just generally speaking, we know that muscle is important. And I think that, you brought up Walter Longo's research. And I think that I do also agree that it misses the mark a little bit because it doesn't take into consideration the dangers of having low muscle mass as you get older. The sarcopenia is a real thing. It happens as we get older. Certain diseases will drive that. So, to me, I think it'd be much better to be 90 years old with a little bit more muscle mass on me than to be 90 years old and be a stick. I think my quality of life is probably going to be better. From a metabolic health perspective, we know that muscle is very metabolically active tissue. It metabolizes both, a lot of glucose and stuff like that. It's basically just a glucose dumping ground. So there's a lot of benefit to carrying more muscle mass.
Which is insulin independent, we should also mention as well, right?
Yes.
It's an insulin independent process via the GLUT4. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah, great addition there because, you don't, again, if you're dealing with insulin resistance, you obviously don't want to be producing, stimulating a lot of insulin production. So muscle is a way that you can, still dispose of glucose independent of having to have that. So that's the issue with that low protein recommendation. There was a study that came out, it's been probably 4 years ago now, that looked at men and women it was like a 12-week study, men and women following a keto diet. I think they were doing, it was either the 20 or the 25% of their calories coming from protein, and they were resistance training. And both groups lost muscle from doing that. And I think they may have also been in a calorie deficit as well, which, is going to naturally make it a little bit harder to gain muscle, not impossible, but a little bit harder to gain muscle. But that's what we're risking here is that if you're keeping your protein low outside of all of the other stuff, there's all the other things, again, that amino acids from protein play a role in. Just on the muscle side of things, you're losing that. And that's important for everybody. That's not just important for the person that wants to have like, big arms and big legs and stuff like that. Like this is for the person, even the person that wants to be slim or trim or cut or whatever the phrase is that people are throwing around now. You're still talking about muscle, and you want to have that muscle, regardless of if you think you want to be bulky or not. So that's really what we're running into with these low protein recommendations is that people aren't getting that aspect of a ketogenic diet. And you also can't completely forget about the fact of what typically comes with protein rich foods. Like on a keto diet, if you're eating a lot of protein rich foods, most likely that's coming from red meat, which is the most nutrient dense food on the planet. So if you're eating less of that, you're lessening the opportunities for you to be increasing your micronutrient intake. And not only your micronutrient intake, but micronutrients in their most bioavailable form for us as humans. So there's so many things that, everybody thinks that the low protein is like, that we like to check the box of like, oh, low protein will be anti-aging, keep my blood sugar in check, and that's it. And it's like, no, neither of those things are necessarily true. And then you're also going to miss out on all of these other benefits of that protein. So it's a big concern.